Thick fog blanketed the runway at Tenerife's Los Rodeos airport, turning the bustling airfield into a treacherous maze. Two colossal Boeing 747s, one from KLM, the other from Pan Am, sat unknowingly on a collision course. Delays, frustration, and a catastrophic misunderstanding set the stage for a disaster no one saw coming. Then, in a split second, the unthinkable happened. Engines roared, tires screeched, and as one plane thundered down the runway, another stood helplessly in its path. The impact was immediate. Fire and chaos engulfed the airfield. 583 lives were lost that day, and aviation was never the same again. What went so horribly wrong? How did a simple miscommunication between pilots and air traffic control lead to such a devastating catastrophe? And what crucial lessons were learned from this tragedy? This is the story of Tenerife, the day the skies turned deadly and the world was forced to rethink the way we fly. Los Rodeos Airport on the Spanish island of Tenerife had never been busier. The air traffic controllers were overwhelmed, struggling to manage an influx of aircraft. A terrorist bombing at a larger airport in nearby Las Palmas had forced dozens of flights to be diverted here. The small airport, with only a single runway and a parallel taxiway, was now handling an unprecedented level of air traffic. Pilots and crews tried to navigate the congestion, waiting for clearance to taxi or take off. Among them was Pan Am Flight 1736, a Boeing 747 en route to Las Palmas. The crew, led by Captain Victor Grubbs, First Officer Robert Bragg, and Flight Engineer George Warnes, was eager to complete their journey. They had a long trip ahead. After Las Palmas, they were scheduled to fly to Paris and then back to New York. It was meant to be a smooth and well-planned itinerary, but their departure was delayed. Directly in front of them, a KLM 747 had stopped to refuel, blocking their path. First Officer Bragg asked the KLM crew how long the refueling would take. The answer, 45 minutes. The Pan Am crew could do nothing but wait. Frustration grew. The passengers, already exhausted from a 12-hour journey from Los Angeles, were unaware of the exact reasons for the delay. Some had been on the plane since New York. Hunger and fatigue set in. Finally, the KLM aircraft completed refueling and requested clearance to start its engines. The Pan Am crew followed suit, eager to resume their journey. The captain announced to the passengers that they were finally cleared to move, reassuring them that they would be airborne within 15 minutes. However, as both 747s prepared to taxi, another challenge emerged. A thick fog began to roll in over the mountainous island. Visibility dropped drastically, reducing the controller's ability to monitor the aircraft's movements. From the cockpit, the Pan Am crew could barely see beyond their own aircraft. The already tense situation at Los Rodeos was about to become even more precarious. Both KLM and Pan Am aircraft were maneuvering on the fog-covered runway, trying to position themselves for departure. To expedite takeoff, air traffic control instructed them to taxi on the same runway. The Pan Am crew was told to follow KLM, backtrack, and exit to maneuver behind the leading aircraft. As they continued, the pilots were keenly aware that once airborne, the flight to Las Palmas would be a mere 25-minute journey. Inside the Pan Am cockpit, First Officer Bragg studied the airport diagram, unfamiliar with the layout. As they navigated the taxiways, they listened to the tower relay clearance instructions to KLM, confirming their route and climb procedures. The atmosphere in the cockpit remained focused, yet routine. But then, something felt off. Through the dense fog, Bragg suddenly spotted lights ahead, moving lights. His voice carried a note of alarm. "I think he's moving," he said, his eyes locked on the distant shape. The realization hit fast. The KLM aircraft was barreling down the runway, picking up speed. The intensity of its landing lights, flickering with movement, confirmed the horrifying truth. It was taking off. "Look at him! That idiot's coming!" a voice erupted in the cockpit. Panic surged. The Pan Am crew desperately tried to steer clear, but there was nowhere to go. The massive KLM aircraft, traveling nearly 200 miles per hour, was already committed to its fateful trajectory. In the final moments, the KLM jet lifted off the runway. For a fleeting second, hope flickered. Maybe, just maybe, it would clear them. But the next instant, Bragg saw the rotating beacon of the KLM aircraft beneath its fuselage. It was too late. "Get off! Get off!" someone shouted. Then, in a split second of helplessness, a silent prayer was whispered before impact. The catastrophic collision sent fire and debris scattering across the Tenerife runway. The unimaginable had happened. Two jumbo jets had collided in a disaster beyond comprehension. In the aftermath, shock set in. When one of the survivors opened his eyes, he found the aircraft's windows had vanished. It looked as if the top of the plane had been sheared away, as though a giant blade had sliced through it. Smoke and flames erupted around him. The urgency was clear. It was time to escape. A 45-foot drop to solid concrete awaited those who dared to jump. Without thinking, one survivor leaped, rolling upon impact, miraculously unhurt. Others, trapped inside the burning wreckage, faced an agonizing choice. The fuselage had gaping holes, potential escape routes, but with no emergency slides, jumping could be deadly. And yet, with fire consuming the aircraft, there was no alternative. "We're going to have to jump," one voice urged. The fear of an imminent explosion loomed large. There was no time to hesitate. One by one, they began leaping to the ground, driven by the desperate instinct to survive. The devastation was overwhelming. Only 61 people from the Pan Am flight made it out alive, including the cockpit crew. The rest, 335 passengers and crew, were lost. The KLM flight suffered even greater tragedy. No one survived. All 248 souls perished. In total, the disaster claimed 583 lives, marking it as the deadliest aviation accident in history. The scale of loss was staggering, 583 people gone in an instant, with only a few escaping from the burning wreckage. It was a tragedy aviation had never fully contemplated, a grim consequence of human error and the unforgiving nature of the skies. The disaster that unfolded was beyond anyone's worst expectations. No one had seriously considered the possibility of two massive aircraft colliding on the ground. But now, the unthinkable had happened. The morning after the tragedy, investigators from Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States arrived at the scene, faced with an unprecedented challenge. The aviation community had little experience with Boeing 747s crashing, and from an accident investigation standpoint, this was as catastrophic as it could get. The situation was clear. Pan Am had been clearing the runway while KLM was on its takeoff roll. Somewhere along the line, something had gone terribly wrong. Investigators were now tasked with the immense challenge of untangling the chain of events that had led to this devastating collision. One of their first priorities was locating the black boxes. These crucial flight recorders could provide insight into what was happening inside both cockpits in the moments before impact. The voice recordings, in particular, were vital. Two fully functional, airworthy aircraft had come together on the same runway, and understanding the sequence of events that led up to that moment was essential. The airport itself posed significant challenges. Controllers had to manage nearly 50 planes within just a few hours, all without the aid of ground radar. At a busy airport, the absence of radar made the job significantly more stressful, requiring controllers to rely solely on visual tracking and pilot reports. With the sudden influx of aircraft, Los Rodeos Airport was handling far more traffic than it was designed for. But was it too much? Had the controllers made a fatal mistake? A visit to the air traffic control tower was the logical next step. One controller described the situation. Aircraft were parked in unconventional positions, forcing pilots to use the runway itself for taxiing. This deviation from standard operating procedures inherently increased risk. The KLM aircraft had been instructed to taxi to the end of the runway, perform a 180-degree turn, and wait for clearance. Minutes later, the crew reported that they were in position and ready for takeoff. Meanwhile, the Pan Am aircraft was moving up the runway, awaiting its own clearance to proceed. Despite the chaos, controllers insisted they had the situation under control. The workload was heavier than ever, but they were managing. However, investigators soon realized that the cause of the disaster extended beyond just a busy airport. The controllers had been under pressure, but they were not overwhelmed. There had to be additional contributing factors. In aviation accident investigations, it was well understood that no single mistake caused a catastrophe. There were always multiple interwoven failures. However, in this case, the investigators faced a significant challenge. No one had actually seen the collision happen. A dense fog had rolled in, reducing visibility to nearly zero. Los Rodeos Airport had a unique geographical characteristic. It sat at an elevation where clouds could suddenly sweep across the runway, obscuring everything from view. Air traffic controllers were blind to the aircraft's exact positions. They had to rely entirely on radio transmissions from the pilots to confirm whether a runway was clear. Under such conditions, precise and unambiguous communication was critical. Investigators gathered recordings from air traffic control, hoping the tapes could provide clarity. Perhaps they would reveal miscommunication or a crucial error that had gone unnoticed. That was the key to solving the mystery, determining exactly where the aircraft had been at the moment of the collision. The truth lay in the voices captured on those tapes, voices that could finally piece together the last moments before disaster struck. As the KLM aircraft continued down the runway, tension filled the air. Urgent voices echoed in the cockpit and control tower, each call a desperate attempt to maintain order in the midst of uncertainty. The phrase, "Get off! Get off! Get off! Get off!" was shouted, yet the events that followed would make history as one of the deadliest air crashes ever recorded. News of the disaster spread rapidly, dominating headlines across the globe. The pressure on investigators mounted as the world demanded answers. Every detail had to be meticulously analyzed, every transmission scrutinized, for the truth behind the catastrophe to emerge. The investigation began with a critical question. What exactly had been communicated to the KLM and Pan Am pilots? Did the Tenerife controller issue any instructions that could have led to the fatal collision? Investigators played back the recordings from the control tower. The KLM crew had been instructed to proceed to the end of the runway, make a 180-degree turn, and report back when ready for ATC clearance. Meanwhile, the Pan Am flight was given directions to vacate the runway at the third intersection on the left, but confusion immediately arose. Clipper 1736, leave the runway, the third one on your left, the controller instructed. The Pan Am pilots hesitated. What did they just ask us to do? Please leave the runway at the third one on your left, the controller repeated. Uncertainty lingered. Taxi down the runway and leave at the first intersection on the left. Is that correct? The Pan Am crew asked, attempting to clarify. Negative. The third one, the controller insisted. Communication barriers complicated the situation further. The two Spanish air traffic controllers, non-native English speakers, struggled to convey precise instructions in aviation English. The Pan Am pilots, trying to decipher the accent and phrasing, were left uncertain about which exit to take. Aware of the potential misunderstanding, the crew sought confirmation. Would you confirm that you want Clipper 1736 to turn left at the third intersection? Finally, the response came. The third one, sir. 1, 2, 3. Despite this clarification, a critical decision was made. The Pan Am aircraft continued past the designated exit. Investigators delved deeper into the reasons behind this choice. The geometry of the turn presented a shocking revelation. To exit at the third intersection, the Pan Am pilots would have needed to execute two extremely sharp turns, each exceeding 90 degrees. For a massive 747 aircraft, such a maneuver was nearly impossible. A 747 is a beast, one expert remarked. You just can't turn it on a dime. Faced with an impractical exit, the experienced Pan Am crew opted for an alternative. Instead of making the difficult turn at exit 3, they proceeded to exit 4, where the turn was far more manageable. But this decision placed them further down the runway, directly in the path of the accelerating KLM aircraft. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. The confusion over taxiway exits, the linguistic challenges, and the practical limitations of the aircraft had all contributed to a tragic sequence of events. Yet, even with these findings, the investigators knew their work was far from over. They had to keep digging. The only taxiway that veered off the runway did so at a sharp 45-degree angle. This design difference played a crucial role in the unfolding confusion. Unlike the other exits, C3 did not provide the necessary path, leading the Pan Am crew to believe that Charlie 4 was their intended exit. In the dense fog, the KLM crew had no visibility of Pan Am 1736 as it taxied past the C3 exit. They remained unaware of its presence on the runway as they waited for their own takeoff clearance. The KLM crew was now poised for departure, awaiting clearance from air traffic control. The first step in their clearance process was a route confirmation, a standard procedure outlining the flight path from Tenerife to their destination. The ATC recording indicated that the KLM pilots were well versed in these procedures and were following them correctly. The instructions were clear: proceed to the Papa Beacon, climb to flight level 90, and execute a right turn after takeoff. The crew acknowledged the clearance and prepared for departure. However, a critical miscommunication was about to unfold. The tower instructed KLM to stand by, emphasizing that takeoff clearance had not yet been granted. This was a routine verification between the controller and the pilots, ensuring all actions were correctly aligned. The KLM captain informed the tower that they were in position but had not received final clearance. Yet, moments later, they initiated their takeoff roll. Investigators were perplexed. Nothing in the tower recordings explained why the KLM crew proceeded down the runway without explicit authorization. As the world struggled to comprehend the enormity of the tragedy, the question remained: how could such an experienced crew make this fatal error? At the crash site, investigators clung to a sliver of hope: the recovery of the black boxes. These cockpit voice recorders were pivotal, providing a window into the moments leading up to the disaster. If any clues remained, they were embedded in those recordings. The investigation shifted to the National Transportation Safety Board headquarters in Washington. Lead investigator Dennis Grassi meticulously synchronized the cockpit voice recordings with the known movements of both aircraft. Every fraction of a second was scrutinized, as precision was paramount in understanding the sequence of events. The Pan Am cockpit recording confirmed their crew's confusion. Struggling to identify the correct taxiway, they inadvertently remained on the runway. They had passed C3, yet no one had seen them in the fog. Did the KLM crew assume Pan Am had already exited? The recording suggested otherwise. KLM should have heard Pan Am's first officer Bragg report their position over the shared radio frequency. His transmission was clear: "We're still on the runway, and we will report when we're clear." The controller reaffirmed, instructing them to report once they were off. Yet, despite this explicit communication, the KLM plane continued its takeoff. Captain Van Zanten, one of the most experienced pilots in the world with over 11,000 flight hours, was at the controls. What led him to believe the runway was clear? What convinced him that he had permission to proceed? It was an error that seemed unfathomable for a crew of such high caliber. Investigators turned their attention to the KLM cockpit voice recorder, hoping to unravel the incomprehensible decision that had set the disaster in motion. Perhaps something captured in those final exchanges would provide the missing link, the answer to why one of the deadliest aviation tragedies in history had occurred. The investigation delved deeper into the sequence of events leading up to the critical moment. The crew knew they had to start from 7, the official check-in time, as they attempt to reconstruct the cockpit environment, analyzing why certain decisions were made and specific words were spoken. The flight time limit was set at 10 hours, with a maximum extension of 13 hours, making every minute crucial. The recording revealed that the captain was deeply concerned about exceeding duty hours. If the crew went over their limit, they would be forced to cancel the flight, a decision that could cost the airline up to $40,000 in hotel accommodations for stranded outbound passengers. The logistical challenge of such a situation was even more daunting in a foreign-out station. Adding to the complexity, Dutch aviation regulators had recently imposed stricter rules on flight crew duty time. Under these new regulations, a pilot exceeding the legal hour limit risked having their license revoked. With these constraints in mind, the KLM crew had left Amsterdam at 9 a.m. and still had to transport passengers to Las Palmas, pick up another set of travelers, and return to Amsterdam before their duty time expired. Every decision had to be precise, with no room for miscalculations. The stakes were high. "If I mess this up, I could actually lose my license," the captain acknowledged. The crew couldn't afford delays, and if they had to wait, they might as well refuel. Van Zanten, determined to stay within his legal flight hours, decided to refuel while grounded in Tenerife. He was doing everything in his power to ensure the flight could proceed as planned. However, fate had other plans. Shortly after refueling began, news came in. Las Palmas had reopened. The plan backfired. The refueling process was taking longer than expected, and the aircraft couldn't move until it was completed. When Las Palmas finally reopened, Van Zanten's aircraft was still on the ground, connected to a fuel hose instead of preparing for departure. Meanwhile, Pan Am's 747, parked nearby, faced its own complications. The KLM aircraft's position meant there wasn't enough wingtip clearance for the Pan Am jet to maneuver. The delay was infuriating for other captains. Van Zanten's aircraft was now the cork in the bottle, holding up operations. More critically, the refueling delay meant the KLM crew had just 2 hours left before they were legally grounded. With half an hour needed to taxi, another half hour to reach Las Palmas, and an hour to swap passengers, the margin for error was razor thin. And then, as if the situation weren't dire enough, the weather took a turn for the worse. Despite the worsening conditions, the order came through. KLM 4805, you are cleared to taxi to the runway. Investigators now faced a pivotal question. Did the urgency to take off, combined with deteriorating weather, push the KLM crew into making a premature move? As the aircraft taxied to the end of the runway, Van Zanten executed a 180-degree turn, preparing for takeoff. The tower tapes confirmed every moment. "Can we hear it from that point, please?" one investigator requested. The checklist was completed. Landing lights turned on. The cockpit recordings provided further evidence of the mounting pressure on Van Zanten. He was in a hurry. The question arose, was he already increasing throttle? Then came a crucial exchange. Wait a minute. We do not have ATC clearance," the first officer noted. "I know that," Van Zanten responded, but he proceeded anyway. Time was an undeniable factor in his decision-making. He had no intention of wasting a second once positioned at the runway's end. "Allen is ready for takeoff," the report noted, but they were still waiting for air traffic control clearance. Then came the chilling realization. The first officer formally requested clearance just a minute before the fatal collision. There was a crucial distinction. He was asking for air traffic control clearance to proceed to the designated route, not clearance to initiate takeoff. But Van Zanten, under immense pressure and racing against time, was already moving forward. At that moment, Tenerife's runway bore witness to a tragedy that would change aviation forever. The investigation reached a critical turning point as investigators analyzed the final moments before the disaster. The air traffic controller issued instructions: maintain flight level 90 and execute a right turn after takeoff. However, what happened next would raise even more questions than answers. The KLM crew acknowledged the clearance to the Papa beacon. The first officer confirmed, "Roger, clear to the Papa beacon." But before he could finish reading back the instructions, Captain Van Zanten had already initiated takeoff. The urgency in the cockpit was evident, yet a crucial misunderstanding was unfolding in real time. As the aircraft accelerated, the Dutch first officer's statement, "We are now at takeoff," took on a chilling significance. He wasn't stating readiness for departure, he was confirming they were actually taking off. This phrase, however, was interpreted differently by the air traffic controllers, who understood it as merely indicating takeoff position. Simultaneously, on the same frequency, Pan Am's crew was reporting that they were still on the runway, and were still taxiing down the runway, they announced. However, due to a fatal radio overlap, a 4-second squeal in the KLM cockpit obscured the warning. The only word that made it through was, "Okay." The two vital instructions, one from air traffic control instructing KLM to stand by, and the other from Pan Am stating they were still on the runway, were never heard. The KLM flight engineer seemed to sense something was amiss. "Is it not clear then?" he asked, referencing Pan Am's presence on the runway. "The Pan American?" he pressed again. But the pilots ignored his concern. It was their last opportunity to prevent the collision. A final call came through. "Papa Alpha 1736, report runway clear." It should have been the moment of realization. "Okay, we'll report when we're clear," came the response. Yet the message didn't register in time. The moment for corrective action had passed. Seconds later, the disaster unfolded. The KLM aircraft, at full throttle, hurtled down the runway, unaware that the Pan Am jumbo jet was still in its path. The result was catastrophic. 583 lives lost in what would become the deadliest aviation accident in history. In the aftermath, investigators scrutinized Captain Van Zanten's career, searching for explanations. How could such an experienced pilot make such a fatal error? Van Zanten was highly regarded, a senior captain, even featured in airline advertisements. Yet, at this moment, he violated one of the most fundamental rules of aviation. Never take off without explicit clearance. It was a lesson taught in the very first stages of flight training, and yet in the chaos of miscommunication, it had been fatally disregarded. As investigators delved deeper into the circumstances surrounding the disaster, they uncovered a startling revelation. Jacob Van Zandt was not just any pilot. He was one of KLM's most esteemed captains, a figurehead of the airline, the director of flight safety, and the head of flight training. The weight of his credentials made the catastrophe all the more perplexing. How could a man of such intelligence, experience, and authority have made such a critical misjudgment? A troubling theory emerged. Van Zandt's elevated status within the airline may have contributed to the disaster. In that era, captains were regarded with unquestioning reverence. Their authority was absolute. To challenge a captain's decision was unthinkable, especially for those of lower rank. The hierarchical structure of the cockpit meant that the first officer and flight engineer were unlikely to question Van Zandt's judgment, even if they had reservations. This cultural deference to authority set the stage for a disastrous miscommunication. The cockpit recordings leading up to the accident only reinforced this notion. When Van Zandt prepared for takeoff, the conversation among the crew suggested uncertainty. A simple question lingered in the air: was the runway truly clear? The exchange hinted at hesitation, yet no one overruled the captain. But Van Zandt's status alone did not explain the most critical question. Why did he believe it was safe to take off in the first place? Investigators scoured his flight records and stumbled upon a significant detail. This was his first flight in 3 months. His recent hours in the cockpit had dwindled, replaced by extensive time in a flight simulator training new pilots. This revelation introduced a new factor: prolonged exposure to a simulated environment. While flight simulators were highly advanced, they lacked one crucial element: air traffic controllers. In training exercises, Van Zandt had grown accustomed to acting as his own clearance authority. The repeated drills in a controlled setting had subtly altered his instincts. In the heat of the moment, faced with deteriorating weather and pressure to depart, his mind defaulted to the patterns ingrained by simulation training. The consequences of this ingrained behavior became evident as the disaster unfolded. 2 conflicting radio transmissions, one indicating that Pan Am was still on the runway and another suggesting it had cleared, effectively canceled each other out. The misunderstanding compounded Van Zandt's misjudgment, making the collision all but inevitable. Then, as the KLM aircraft accelerated down the runway, the crew of the Pan Am flight saw the horror unfolding. "He's moving," someone exclaimed. Panic surged through the cockpit. "Look at him, he's coming." The realization came too late. The urgency in Van Zandt's actions suggested another unsettling truth. He was in a rush. The worsening weather, the delays, and the pressure to maintain credibility may have clouded his judgment. Under stress, even the sharpest minds can make fatal errors. His instincts, honed in the artificial setting of a simulator, had betrayed him in the real world. In the final moments, it became clear that multiple factors had aligned to create a perfect storm. Van Zandt was not a reckless pilot. He was a victim of his own expertise, of a culture that placed captains beyond reproach, and of a training system that had subtly reshaped his decision-making process. The Tenerife disaster became a turning point in aviation history. The aftermath led to sweeping changes, including the development of crew resource management, CRM, training. This new approach emphasized teamwork and open communication, ensuring that authority could be questioned when necessary. The industry had learned a painful lesson. No pilot, no matter how experienced, is infallible. Even the most experienced and highly trained individuals can make mistakes, sometimes without even realizing it. This realization led KLM and other airlines to transform their training methods, emphasizing the importance of teamwork and open communication within the cockpit. Captains were trained to be more responsive to their crewmates, ensuring that every decision was not just a reflection of their authority, but also a product of collaboration. It became clear that relying solely on a single individual, regardless of their expertise, was a flaw in the system. Instead, the entire crew had to function as a collective resource, compensating for human error before it led to catastrophe. Beyond changes in training, the Tenerife disaster also reshaped the very language of aviation communication. Air traffic controllers worldwide adopted stricter protocols to eliminate any ambiguity in their instructions. The word takeoff was no longer used casually. Controllers would only say it when they were explicitly authorizing an aircraft to leave the ground. Instead, terms like after departure or specific directional commands were used to prevent any misinterpretation. This shift in language was a direct result of the miscommunication that had played a critical role in the accident. The 583 lives lost in the tragedy were not in vain. The lessons learned from that fateful day at Tenerife revolutionized aviation safety. Procedures were overhauled, communication was refined, and the rigid hierarchy within cockpits was dismantled in favor of a more cooperative and error-resistant approach. The accident, while devastating, became a turning point, one that ultimately made flying safer for generations to come. The Tenerife disaster remains a haunting reminder of how a single moment of miscommunication can change history. In the aftermath, the aviation industry made critical changes to ensure such a tragedy would never happen again. Standardized phraseology, enhanced crew resource management, and stricter cockpit procedures all emerged from the lessons learned that day, saving countless lives in the years that followed. Thank you for watching and taking this journey with us through one of aviation's darkest days. If you found this video insightful, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback helps us improve and continue bringing you the most detailed investigations into history's most gripping air disasters. If you noticed anything we might have missed or have additional insights, we'd love to hear from you. And as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. See you in the next one.